In the spring of 2018, a food scientist named Dr. Noel Fitch drove out to a 12-acre homestead in Goshen County, Indiana, to look at a jar of something that had been alive since before either of them was born. He came in a white Purdue extension pickup in clean shoes and a pressed shirt with a university logo stitched above the breast pocket, and he stood in the kitchen of a farmhouse that had not changed much since Eisenhower and studied a half-gallon clay crock that smelled faintly of vinegar and warm bread. He was 50 years old, held a doctorate in food microbiology, and had spent the better part of 2 decades advising commercial bakeries on how to standardize their operations. He was sincere, genuinely well-meaning, and completely certain of what he was looking at. "Son," he said, setting the crock back on the counter, "what you've got here is a hobby organism. It's lovely for your own kitchen. It's not a supply chain." The young man standing across from him did not answer right away. He had flour on his forearms and a canvas work apron tied at his waist, and he looked at the crock the way you look at something you have known your whole life and have only recently been told is worth defending. His name was Caleb Mast. He was 28 years old, and that jar had been in his family since 1946. 4 years after that kitchen visit, in the second week of March 2022, Caleb received a check for $61,200 for flour and water, and 75 years of somebody paying attention to what was alive inside a clay crock in Goshen County, Indiana. This is the story of the span between those 2 moments. If you have ever watched a system fail at exactly the point where someone told you it was the only option, you might want to stay with this one. Caleb Mast grew up in that farmhouse, the grandson of Marta Mast, who was the kind of woman people in that county described by saying she was known for 2 things: her bread and her memory for everything that mattered. She had come to Indiana from a German-American family with Mennonite roots, married into the Mast homestead in 1974, and brought almost nothing with her except a clay crock and the instructions her own grandmother had passed to her in Bavaria, in a recipe ledger written in a German cursive so compressed and precise it looked more like engineering than cooking. The crock held what Marta always called the culture. Not a starter, not a leavening agent. The culture. The word mattered to her, the way words matter to people who have tended something alive long enough to understand that it has its own character. It was a living fermentation ecosystem, a colony of wild lactobacillus bacteria and wild yeast that had been fed flour and water twice a week, every week, for as long as anyone in the family had kept track. Marta's grandmother had brought it from Bavaria in 1946. Marta had received it as a young woman and carried it forward for 73 years. By 2014, when Caleb came home from Purdue University, with a marketing degree he had not been sure how to use, and a grandmother who was beginning to slow down, the culture was older than the farmhouse roof, older than the refrigerator, older than most of what anybody in Goshen County thought of as permanent. Marta began teaching him in the kitchen the autumn of that year. Not recipes, exactly. The culture was not a recipe. It was more like a set of relationships. Between the bacteria and the wild yeast, between the colony and the water from the well, between the particular ambient temperature of that kitchen and the pace at which the culture rose and fell on its twice-weekly feeding schedule. She taught him to read the surface before opening the crock, because the dome or the collapse told you something about where in the cycle you were finding it. She taught him the smell at different stages, sharp and acidic when the bacteria were active and the culture hungry, yeasty and almost sweet in the hour after feeding when the wild yeasts were rising into their peak activity, flat and slightly off when the culture had been neglected past its limit. She showed him how to test its activity by dropping a small spoonful into a glass of water. A healthy culture floated. A stressed one sank. "It tells you what it needs," Marta said once, lifting the crock from the counter and setting it in his hands. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." She showed him the ledger, translating the German as she went, pointing out the entries her grandmother had written in Bavaria and the entries she herself had added across 7 decades in Indiana. The ledger was small, cloth-covered, its spine cracked and its pages darkened at the edges from years of flowery hands. Some entries were practical, noting feeding ratios, water temperatures, and how the culture had adjusted through particularly cold or hot seasons. Others were observational in a way that was harder to categorize. One entry from 1962 noted that the culture had produced a particularly sour loaf in the week following the death of Marta's first child, a stillbirth in the hard January of that year. She had written in German that she thought it was the temperature drop from keeping the house cooler than usual in her grief, but she had not been certain, and she had left the observation in the ledger without resolving it. That was the kind of knowledge the ledger carried, accurate, specific, and honest about the limits of what could be known. Let me tell you what that ledger actually captured, because it matters to everything that came later. A wild sourdough culture is not a single organism. It is a community. The lactobacillus bacteria produce lactic acid and acetic acid as they metabolize the flour's sugars, and those acids do 2 things simultaneously. They create the complex sour flavor that commercial yeast cannot replicate, and they lower the pH of the environment enough to suppress pathogenic bacteria. The culture is, in the language of microbiologists, self-defending. Industrial yeast, by contrast, is a single selected strain of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, bred for speed and uniformity, producing carbon dioxide quickly and reliably, but no acid complexity and no protective environment. Buy a packet of commercial yeast, and you are buying uniformity. Maintain a wild culture across decades, and you are accumulating something different, an ecosystem that has adapted to one specific set of conditions, one well's mineral profile, one kitchen's ambient yeast population, one region's seasonal temperature swings. The culture in Marta's crock was not just old, it was local. It was a biological record of that particular piece of ground and the air above it, written in the chemistry of a living thing that had been paying attention for 75 years. Caleb understood this because Marta explained it, and because his marketing degree had taught him, without meaning to, that the things hardest to replicate are the things most worth having. He also understood something else. The culture required almost nothing: flour, water, and twice-weekly feeding. No electricity. No refrigerant beyond the cool of the cellar in summer. No inputs beyond what could be grown in any county in Indiana. The crock sat on the counter in all seasons, rose and fell on its schedule, and asked only that someone notice and respond. The 2018 visit, the one that put Dr. Fitch in the kitchen with the crock on a May afternoon, had come about through the Indiana Bakers Cooperative. Caleb had applied for a small business assessment, thinking he might formalize what he was doing at the farmer's market into something with a mailing list and a more reliable output schedule. The assessment was free to cooperative members, and it sent a credentialed food science consultant to evaluate your operation's viability. Dr. Fitch arrived with a tablet and a protective case and a soft-sided cooler for sample collection. He tested the culture's pH across 3 consecutive batches, measuring the variation from one feeding cycle to the next. The variation was real. Wild cultures do not produce identical pH readings the way commercial yeast does, because they are living communities, not isolated strains. He noted this on his tablet. He tasted the bread Caleb baked that morning from the previous feeding's discard, tasted it carefully, and said it was good. Then he set the bread down and said what he said. "Son, what you've got here is a hobby organism. It's lovely for your own kitchen. It's not a supply chain." Caleb had said, "My grandmother kept it for 73 years. Doctor." Fitch had looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has heard this kind of answer before, from good people whose attachment to an old thing made them overestimate its commercial usefulness. "I know," he said, "and that's a beautiful thing. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying that a supply chain requires consistency. And this," he gestured toward the crock, "gives you a beautiful inconsistency. Those are two different products." He closed his tablet. "Sell it at the market by all means. Just don't take out loans against it." Caleb did not take out loans against it. Marta died in February of 2019. She was 81 years old. She left Caleb the ledger and the crock, and she left the 12-acre homestead to him outright. No mortgage, no encumbrance of any kind, because she had paid it off in 1991 and never taken another loan against it. The homestead was not large. It was 12 acres, a farmhouse and 2 outbuildings, and the only thing on it worth more than its assessed value was the clay crock on the kitchen counter. He went on feeding the culture twice a week, the way she had taught him. He baked his own bread, sold small amounts at the Goshen County Farmers Market at $6 a loaf, and spent his evenings reading Marta's ledger with a German dictionary and a lamp. He was not famous. He was not impressive by any external measure. He had a 12-acre paid-off homestead, a canvas apron, flour on his arms, and a clay crock that had outlived 2 world wars and was currently outliving several of his younger neighbors' equipment loans. People at the farmer's market bought his bread and told him it was the best bread they had eaten in years, and he thanked them and drove home and fed the culture on Tuesday and Saturday, and did not make plans beyond that. His neighbor, Dale Hostetler, was one of those. Dale was 41 years old, ran 80 acres on the other side of the property line, and had been following the Indiana Bakers Cooperative's expansion guidance since 2017, when commercial artisan bread had briefly become fashionable enough that the cooperative put out a bulletin recommending small operators consider commercial-grade deck ovens and regional distribution contracts. Dale was a good farmer and a willing baker, not a foolish man, simply one who trusted the people with credentials to tell him what the market wanted. In February of 2020, he borrowed $47,000 and installed a 2-deck commercial oven in his outbuilding. He signed a franchise distribution agreement with a regional grocery chain that promised shelf placement in 14 stores by Q3 of that year. He used commercial yeast, as the cooperative recommended, and a sourdough flavoring concentrate that was added to his batches to approximate the flavor of a wild culture without the variability. The loaves looked right. They smelled approximately right. They came out at a consistent weight within a 2-gram tolerance, batch after batch. Dr. Noel Fitch had written the guidance that Dale was following. The culture in Caleb's crock, meanwhile, sat on the counter and rose and fell and was fed on Tuesday and Saturday mornings, as it had been fed for 73 years. By the time Dale signed his distribution agreement in February of 2020, the world was already beginning to close down in ways that nobody in Goshen County had fully processed. Caleb noticed it first, not in the news, but in the way the county's feed and supply store seemed quieter than it should have been for the season, and in a phone conversation with a baker in Fort Wayne who said she was having trouble sourcing commercial yeast from her distributor. Commercial yeast, she explained, was facing supply disruption because the major fermentation facilities that produced industrial Saccharomyces cerevisiae were themselves affected by the closures and labor shortages beginning to ripple through the food processing sector. She laughed when she said it, the kind of laugh that is not quite disbelief and not quite humor. March of 2020 arrived and brought with it what Caleb later described simply as the quiet. Bakeries across Indiana closed or reduced to minimal operations. The grocery chain that had signed Dale's distribution contract froze all new supplier onboarding, citing supply chain uncertainty. Commercial yeast, the backbone of every commercial bakery and most home baking operations, vanished from grocery store shelves in days. By the end of March, the price a commercial bakery could source it for had tripled, where it could be sourced at all. Dale's $47,000 deck oven sat idle in his outbuilding for 11 weeks. Caleb's culture sat on the counter and was fed on Tuesday and Saturday mornings. It rose, it fell. It smelled of vinegar and warm bread. It had survived the 1947 passage from Bavaria in a crock packed in a steamer trunk and the 1974 move from its previous home in Indiana, and Marta's 2 hip surgeries in the 90s, and the winter of 2001 when the farmhouse furnace failed and the kitchen dropped to 40 degrees for 4 days. It had never needed a supply chain. It did not know one had collapsed. Caleb started getting calls in April of 2020. A woman in Elkhart wanted to know if he sold starter. A man in South Bend had seen one of his market posts and asked if he had enough to share. By May, he had more requests than he could answer, and he began packaging small amounts of dried culture, because drying was what made shipping possible. Let me tell you about that process, because it is the mechanism that changed everything. A live sourdough culture cannot be shipped at room temperature in any reliable way. It is active, consuming itself, changing. But a live culture can be dried, and when you reduce the water content of the culture below what microbiologists call the critical water activity threshold, roughly 0.6, you suspend the metabolism of the bacteria and yeasts without killing them. They go dormant. The dried culture looks like pale, cracked flakes, smells faintly of old bread, and can sit at room temperature in a sealed packet for months. To reconstitute it, you add water and flour, hold it at room temperature for 24 to 48 hours, and the colony wakes up. It returns to activity because the organisms are alive, only sleeping. Because the colony is a community rather than a single strain, because its multiple species have redundant metabolic pathways, it is more robust in the dormant state than commercial yeast, which is a single selected strain with no community to buffer against stress. Caleb learned the drying process from a combination of Marta's ledger, which had brief notes on drying for travel, written in German in the margin of a 1952 entry, and from a food preservation manual he found at the county library. He spread the culture thin on sheet pans, dried it at a low oven temperature over 6 hours, scraped the dried flakes, and packaged them in small craft envelopes. He sold them locally at $12 an ounce and priced them that way because he did not yet know what they were worth. He sold out of every batch within 3 days. He priced it at $12 an ounce because that was what he thought people would pay, and it turned out to be too low. People paid it readily, without negotiating, which was a market signal he filed away without acting on immediately. He began feeding the culture more aggressively, building its volume, harvesting the discard that accumulated between feedings, drying and packaging it methodically. His outbuilding, the same outbuilding that had stored Marta's canning equipment and her husband's tillage tools, became a small drying and packaging operation over the summer of 2020. He built 2 additional sheet pan racks from lumber in the county supply store's discount pile. He ordered craft envelopes in a quantity that seemed extravagant at the time and turned out to be insufficient by July. If you are thinking about what those first buyers felt when they opened their packages, consider the spring of 2020 from the perspective of someone who had baked their bread from commercial yeast their entire life and suddenly could not find commercial yeast anywhere. The grocery store shelves had been empty of yeast since the 3rd week of March. A packet of dried culture that could be revived into a functioning leaven in 48 hours was not a novelty. It was a solution to a practical problem. It was, for some of those first buyers, the only way they could bake bread in the months ahead. And the bread they baked with it, most of them would later say, was better than anything they had made before. Caleb got letters, handwritten ones, some of them from home bakers who did not typically write letters, but who wanted to say that the bread they had made from the culture was different from other bread, and that the difference was not subtle. By September of that year, he had waiting lists. If you are wondering whether it matters that Dr. Fitch called it a hobby organism, consider what the spring of 2020 looked like. In the spring of 2020, every commercial bakery in Indiana that had been following his guidance on industrial yeast dependency was either closed or paying 3 times the input cost for a supply that was unreliable. They were the ones with the standardized operations, the consistent product, the predictable output. The hobby organism, meanwhile, was being packaged on sheet pans in an outbuilding in Goshen County and mailed to home bakers who found it was the most reliable fermentation source available to them. Hobby was not the word that fit, but it was the word that had been on record since 2018. Dale Hostetler's deck oven came back online in June of 2020, when his distributor sent a partial reopening notice. The grocery chain had renegotiated its contracts during the closure, and Dale's franchise agreement had been quietly downgraded from 14-store placement to a regional pilot of 3 stores, at a margin that barely covered his ingredient costs. He was baking again, but the math had changed in ways he had not anticipated when he signed the loan in February. He was, by the end of 2020, covering his costs and not much more. The $47,000 loan was still on the books. Caleb paid his heating bill and his property taxes, and drove the same 2004 truck he had been driving since Marta died. He filed a 1-page income report at the end of the year showing that the dried culture operation had earned him $11,400 in its first 8 months. He had not sought that income. He had not planned for it. He had simply responded to what was alive in the crock, the way Marta had taught him, and the crock had responded in kind. September of 2021 brought the Indiana Regional Bakers Association fall meeting, held in a community hall in Elkhart. Dr. Noel Fitch presented a panel on scaling operations in uncertain supply environments. He was good at this, thoughtful and specific, genuinely trying to help the room navigate a difficult period. Toward the end of the session, someone asked about heritage starters, about the trend he might have noticed of home bakers and small operators trying to cultivate wild cultures rather than depending on commercial yeast. Dr. Fitch paused. He was not unkind about it. He acknowledged the trend, acknowledged the appeal. There's real affection in this room for what I'd call sentimental projects, he said from the podium. Starter cultures, heirloom grains, the romance of the old methods, and I respect that deeply. But affection doesn't meet an order for 500 loaves. Consistency is what a commercial supply chain requires, and living organisms, by definition, are not consistent. Caleb was sitting in the third row. He did not raise his hand. He drove home, fed the culture on Tuesday morning, and read 3 more pages of Marta's ledger. He had been thinking since the summer about something the library manual had mentioned. Dried cultures, if the source colony was robust enough, could retain the full complexity of the original ecosystem through dormancy and reconstitution. The manual cited a food science study from the University of Wisconsin that had tested revival rates on cultures dried by various methods. The best method retained more than 94% of original colony diversity. The question was whether Marta's culture was robust enough to survive the drying and reconstitution process at commercial volume without losing the thing that made it worth sending. He had been testing this quietly through 2020 and into 2021, mailing small packages to home bakers around the country who had found him through the farmers market network and the handful of baking forums where his name had started appearing. He asked for feedback. He got it in letters and emails and occasional phone calls from people who had never called a farmer in Indiana before and felt slightly odd doing it. The culture revived reliably, produced bread with the sour complexity characteristic of a long-established wild culture, and was notably more resilient through the revival process than other starters the bakers had tried. One baker in Maine wrote a letter of 2 pages describing the crust structure and the crumb density in careful detail. One in Oregon sent a photograph of a loaf and a handwritten note that said simply, "This is what I meant when I said bread." What he was building, without calling it that, was a body of evidence. Not a study, not a controlled experiment, but a record of consistent outcomes across different hands, different ovens, different water supplies, different climates. The culture revived in Maine. It revived in Oregon. It revived in a Denver apartment and a farmhouse in central Kentucky, and a townhouse kitchen in Columbus, Ohio. Its consistency was not the consistency Dr. Fitch meant, the 2-gram tolerance uniformity of a commercial yeast batch. It was the consistency of a community that carried its own resilience wherever it went. His cousin Nora arrived that November. She was 27, fresh from a hospitality management degree at Indiana University, and she had come home to Goshen County partly because her own job search in Indianapolis had stalled, and partly because Caleb's operation had gotten interesting enough that her mother had called and suggested she look at it. She was skeptical in the way that a hospitality degree makes you skeptical of handmade operations at kitchen scale. She walked into the outbuilding and looked at the sheet pans and the craft envelopes and the hand labeling setup and said, "How do you even know it's the same thing each time?" Caleb handed her the ledger. She spent 2 evenings with it, reading what she could and asking Caleb to translate the German. She had questions that came from the hospitality train. What was the hydration ratio? What was the target fermentation temperature? What were the specifications for the dried product's shelf life? These were reasonable questions, and he answered them, but they were not the right questions yet. The ledger did not answer in specifications. It answered in observations, in dated notes from specific seasons, in one woman's 73 years of paying attention to a living thing that behaved differently each week, depending on what that week had been. On the 3rd evening, she asked to bake a loaf herself, using the culture's discard from that Tuesday's feeding. Caleb set her up with the flour ratios Marta used, a hydration level appropriate to the farmhouse kitchen's dry air winter conditions, and left her to it. She mixed the dough at 7 in the evening, let it ferment overnight on the counter, shaped it in the morning, and baked it in the farmhouse oven at noon the following day. She pulled it from the oven and tapped the bottom the way Caleb had shown her, listening for the hollow sound that tells you the loaf is baked through. It sounded right. She set it on the counter and cut it after 20 minutes, which is not enough time, but she was impatient, and stood in the kitchen and ate a slice while it was still warm, without butter, without anything, and she did not say anything for a long time. "It tastes like something," she said finally. It was the kind of statement you make when you have spent 3 years in a hospitality management program, learning to describe flavor, and you have just encountered something that defeats the vocabulary. Caleb nodded. He had heard similar things from the people who mailed him letters. She asked, a week later, how the drying process worked. She asked the week after that whether there was a reason the envelopes were labeled by hand rather than printed. She spent December learning the culture's twice-weekly feeding schedule, learning to read its surface, learning the smell at different stages of the cycle, learning the way the dome held after a good feeding, and the way the surface went flat and liquid-looking when the culture had been left too long. By January, she was feeding it herself on the mornings Caleb needed to run to the county supply store or the post office. She stopped asking about specifications and started asking about the ledger. She wanted to know what Marta had observed in the decades before Caleb inherited the culture, wanted to understand how the culture had changed over time, whether the flavor had shifted or whether it was continuous. Caleb told her he did not know for certain, that the ledger described observations but not controlled comparisons. Nora said that was fine. That was actually what made it useful. The culture did not care who fed it, as long as someone did. January of 2022 brought a letter from a buyer Caleb had not contacted directly. Her name was Petra Holm, and she held the title of Senior Regional Buyer for a specialty grocer called Heartland Table, which operated 14 stores across Indiana and Ohio. The letter was brief, professionally formal, and said she had become aware of his operation through a supplier network and would like to visit in late February if he was willing to have her. He wrote back and said he was. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in the last week of February, driving alone in a pale green sedan, and she did not bring a clipboard or a slide deck. She walked through the outbuilding without taking notes, asked 2 operational questions that were short and specific, and then asked Caleb to show her the culture itself. He brought her into the kitchen and set the crock on the counter. She stood in front of it for a moment, the way people who know what they are looking for take a moment to confirm they are looking at it. She asked him to open the crock, and she leaned forward and smelled it, and she asked him to describe the feeding schedule and the drying process in plain terms. He did, briefly, in the same practical language he would have used with Marta. Then she asked him to show her a sample of the dried culture. He brought a small jar of flakes from the outbuilding and set it on the counter beside the crock. She picked it up. She held it in both hands. She turned it once, slowly, studying the color and texture of the dried flakes. "How old is this organism?" she said. Caleb said, 75 years, give or take whatever was in Bavaria before that. She held the jar. She did not consult a phone or a tablet. She looked at the flakes, and then she set the jar down. And there was a silence in the kitchen of the kind that has weight and direction, a silence that is going somewhere rather than simply existing. "We'll take 180 pounds, she said. $3.40 a pound. The check arrived the second week of March 2022. $61,200 for flour and water and 75 years of someone paying attention to what was alive in a clay crock in Goshen County, Indiana. That number landed in the kitchen the way a verdict lands, not with noise, but with the particular silence of a thing that has been true for a long time and has only just been said out loud. Caleb set the check on the kitchen table, next to the crock, and stood looking at both of them for a while. Then he called Nora in from the outbuilding and showed her. She picked up the check and read it twice, and set it back down and went to the counter and fed the culture, because it was a Tuesday. In the days between Petra Holmes' visit and the arrival of the check, Dr. Noel Fitch called. He had heard, through the cooperatives network, that Caleb had been in conversation with Heartland Table. He was not hostile about it, but he was not entirely comfortable either. "I understand you've been talking to buyers," he said. "I'd be careful. A living organism is not a SKU. Supply chains want SKUs." He said it the way a person says something they have believed for 20 years and have only just started to wonder about. The way caution sounds when it is standing at the edge of reconsidering itself. Caleb thanked him and said he would be careful and hung up. The check arrived 5 days later. 3 days after the check arrived, Dr. Fitch called again. This time his tone was different. He had heard, through the same network, the figure. The call was cordial now, and careful in a different way. He said he wanted to understand what Caleb was selling, specifically, and how the drying process worked in terms of colony viability at scale. He said he had been watching the home baking trends from the pandemic period with interest, and was reconsidering some of his earlier guidance about wild cultures in commercial contexts. Caleb answered his questions plainly, the way he answered most questions. He explained the drying process. He explained the reconstitution timeline. He explained that the colony's complexity was what made it commercially interesting, not despite the variability, but because the variability was, in the language of the market, the product. There was a pause on the line. "I understand," Dr. Fitch said. Then he said, "I said some things at the Bakers Association meeting in September about sentimental projects." "I remember," Caleb said. "I may have undersold the resilience argument," Dr. Fitch said. It was a careful sentence, the sentence of a man who does not admit error easily, but who is doing it because the arithmetic has left him no other option. Caleb told him there was nothing to apologize for. He meant it. The 180 pounds of dried culture shipped from Goshen County in 11 days. Heartland Table placed a second order in May for 220 pounds. Nora, by that point, was managing the outbuilding operation and had set up a labeling printer and a packing process that could handle the volume without waking anyone before 6 in the morning. She was also corresponding with the home bakers who had been on the waiting list since 2020, and she began fulfilling those orders as the culture's production volume increased through the spring. Caleb took the $61,200 and paid off the repair he had been deferring on the farmhouse roof, bought a new drying rack for the outbuilding, and deposited the rest. He did not expand beyond what the 12-acre homestead could support. He did not take investment. He did not hire staff beyond Nora, who was family and was learning the culture's rhythms the way Marta had learned them, through repetition and attention over weeks and months rather than training materials and a checklist. By the end of 2022, there were 600 home bakers on the waiting list for Mass Culture Starter, which was what Nora had named the packaged product, over Caleb's mild objection that it sounded too much like a brand. It was a brand, she pointed out. It just happened to be 75 years old. Dale Hostetler came over in the spring of 2022, after the second Heartland Table order had shipped. He walked through the outbuilding and asked Caleb questions that were technically similar to the ones Petra Holm had asked, but with a different weight behind them. Petra's questions had been from outside, from someone assessing a product she did not have any personal stake in. Dale's questions were from inside, from a man who had been on the other path for 2 years and had watched where it went. He was not resentful. That is worth saying plainly. Dale Hostetler was not a man who resented his neighbors for succeeding while he struggled. He was a good man who had followed credentialed guidance in good faith and had come out the other side of a crisis with a $47,000 loan still on his books and a grocery chain contract expiring in July that would not be renewed. He asked his questions with the directness of someone who has nothing left to protect by pretending not to be curious. The grocery chain had replaced his 3-store slot with a larger regional supplier in February. They had been polite about it. It was simply a numbers decision, they said, and the numbers were about scale and margin and delivery consistency, and at his volume he could not compete on any of those dimensions. That was true. The extension guidance had always said small operators needed to find a niche, and he had tried to find the commercial bread niche, and the commercial bread niche had turned out to have a floor below which small operators were not viable. Caleb showed him the crock. He explained the feeding schedule, the drying process, the reconstitution timeline. He gave Dale a small envelope of dried culture, the same craft envelope he sold at $12 an ounce, and told him to revive it and try it and see what he thought. He asked for nothing in return. Dale revived the culture that weekend, held it at room temperature for 48 hours with 2 flour and water feedings, and baked a loaf on Monday morning. He drove to Caleb's place that afternoon without calling first, still wearing the apron he had been baking in, and stood in the kitchen with flour on his hands, and a look on his face that Nora later said was the same look she had had when she ate her first slice. "Where does it come from?" he said, not quite as a question. "The flavor?" Caleb told him about the bacteria, the acids, the adaptation over time. The fact that the culture was a community rather than a single strain, that its complexity was exactly the product. He talked for maybe 5 minutes, which was a long time for him. Then he offered to help Dale start his own culture from a cutting of Marta's, if Dale was willing to commit to maintaining it through a full year before selling anything from it. The year was not arbitrary. A culture needed time in its new home before it could be called local. It needed to adapt to the mineral profile of Dale's well water, the ambient temperature patterns in his kitchen, the particular mixture of wild yeast floating in the air of his 80 acres. That process could not be hurried. Either you gave it the year or you had something, but you did not have what Caleb had. Dale said he would think about it. He came back the following week and said yes. Caleb gave him a half-cup of active culture in a jar, walked him through the twice-weekly feeding schedule, and told him to call if anything looked wrong. Then he handed him a photocopy of the relevant pages of Marta's ledger, translated into English, in the same handwriting Caleb used for his own notes. The ledger was not something he could give away. It was the original. But the knowledge in it, 73 years of observation, the margin notes and the dated entries and the 1962 grief and the winter of 2001, and the plain record of what a living thing had done across 7 decades of attentive custody. That was something you could copy out and hand to a neighbor, and Caleb did it without being asked. There is something the county extension system measures well, and something it does not. It measures yield per acre and cost per unit and distribution margin and compliance with safety standards. And it does this because these are the things that can be put into a spreadsheet and compared across operations of different sizes and types. Dr. Noel Fitch was good at this, genuinely good, and the guidance he issued to the Indiana Bakers Cooperative had helped hundreds of small bakers improve their margins and their consistency in normal times. He was not wrong about commercial yeast reliability when the supply chain was intact. What the spreadsheet did not measure was what happened when the supply chain was not intact. What it could not capture was the value of an ecosystem that needed nothing from a distribution network, that had no minimum order quantity and no lead time requirement and no single strain vulnerability to a fermentation facility going offline. The spreadsheet could not measure what it cost to maintain something that adapted rather than failed, that absorbed disruption the way old wood absorbs water, slowly and without complaint. Marta had understood this, not through analysis, but through 73 years of observation, through the knowledge of someone who has tended one living thing through enough seasons to know that what looks like fragility is sometimes the most durable structure available. She had written something in the ledger, in the last dated entry, in March of 2018, a few months before Dr. Fitch came to the kitchen with his clean shoes and his doctorate. It was in German, 4 words, which Caleb translated eventually as "patience is also a method." He had the sentence written on a small card, taped to the inside of the outbuilding door, where Nora saw it every morning when she came in to start the day's work. By the fall of 2023, Nora had digitized the entire ledger, translating it with help from a German studies professor at the University of Notre Dame, who had emailed Caleb after reading about the starter in a food journal that had run a short piece in the summer. The professor asked permission to include several pages in a book she was writing about immigrant foodways in the Midwest. Caleb said she could, and asked only that she note the culture was still alive and that cuttings were available on a waiting list. The crock sat on the counter as it had always sat. It was fed on Tuesday and Saturday mornings, which was how Marta had fed it, which was how Marta's grandmother had fed it before that, in a kitchen in Bavaria before the war and in a farmhouse in Indiana across everything that came after. The culture did not know it was famous. It did not know about the $61,200 or the check or the waiting list of 600 bakers or the ledger's new life as a digitized document in a university library. It only knew to rise and fall on the schedule, to consume what was offered, to transform flour and water into something that tasted like a particular place across a particular stretch of time. There are 2 ways to know something. One of them arrives through a degree and a methodology and a set of measurements that are the same regardless of where you take them, and it is genuinely useful when the world it was built for holds its shape. The other arrives through 75 years of feeding a living thing twice a week, through the understanding that belongs to someone who has watched a single system through enough seasons to know it from the inside, and that knowledge does not transfer easily to a slide deck and cannot be ordered from a supplier and does not have a minimum viable batch size. What a supply chain values is reliability under normal conditions. What a culture carries is resilience through the ones that are not. The culture was alive when everything else ran out. That was not sentiment. That was not a hobby. It was the arithmetic of a community that had learned, across generations of careful attention, what it needed to survive. The crock is still on the counter. The culture still rises and falls on a Tuesday and Saturday schedule. Nora comes in early and feeds it, and taps the card on the inside of the outbuilding door before she begins the day's packaging. The 4 words in German that Marta wrote down in the last spring of her life. What is patient enough to outlast the disruption is what belongs.